Here is the introduction to the planning framework. And again, this is the first of 3 different tasks that you will be completing for the EdTPA. And they really represent 3 different important elements of teaching. Now, in the planning task, the key ideas to focus on are the central focus, which they'll want you to define. And basically, this is the overarching idea that covers the whole learning progression. This is the bigger skill that you're wanting to do. It's much closer to a standard than anything else. And from that big idea, it's a really complicated skill or piece of knowledge, you're going to be pulling out an essential strategy for either comprising or composing text. Now, that's in the literacy version, and I said I was going to spend a lot of time in the literacy version. In the math, it's about problem solving, and science and social studies, they have their own things. But in literacy, it's all about this essential strategy and how do you build this and how do you deconstruct a really complicated thing into its component skills. Now, an example of that is this picture here where we do have this central focus. And the example that we'll use, and we'll kind of run with this one going forward, is the idea of persuasive writing, right? There's a lot that goes into this. You can spend years trying to learn how to write persuasively, but you can identify the important sub-skills or the important bigger strategies, right? And so when we talk about what might an essential literacy strategy be for persuasive writing, well, constructing an argument, right, or using evidence, those are 2 big things. Each one could work by themselves. But say that in my learning progression, I'm focusing on constructing an argument. Now in here, right, I might go with ideas of separating opinion from fact. I might think about logical sequencing. I might think about the words that we use, specific phrases and clauses that go into it. Furthermore, therefore, in conclusion, in summary, things like that, right? And so I can break it down into all these different related skills. And when I do that, I am basically taking this really complicated thing, right? I'm the expert, and somebody doesn't know how to do this. I'm saying, okay, well, it's too big to handle kind of all at once, so let's break it down into some major chunks. That's my constructing argument, right? And then I'm going to break that down into even more manageable chunks. I'm going to teach you individual skills. We're going to integrate them, tie them together, and then you should be able to construct a good argument by the time you're done with this thing. Now, that's the idea of the central focus, the essential strategy, and the building knowledge. Other ideas are knowledge of your students, basically the prior knowledge that they have about academic stuff that matters, and then also the personal assets that they bring with them to the table, their interests, their values, their common experiences, the things that they do in their spare time that they know a lot about that you can kind of leverage and use to make your points clear, to make them stick, right? Another big idea is going to be language demands. We'll talk about that. Come in 3 forms unless we're doing math, in which case there's a 4th. But it's really vocabulary, syntax, and discourse. Vocabulary, and we'll talk more about this in a bit, just words that are essential to doing what you need them to do. Syntax is things like sentence structure. In social studies, it might be reading a map. In math, it might be equations, things like that. And then discourse is the specific way that you write. And so writing in a persuasive essay has a very different form than if I'm writing an informational article or if I'm writing a story, right? All those, a story is centered around characters who kind of move through time, and there's a certain linear sequence to it typically, right? But it's a linear time sequence. When I think about informational text, it's structured way differently, where I have this main topic sentence and then I give you information about it with all these supporting details, right? And that paragraph might be couched in a larger hierarchy of ideas. And a persuasive article has its own form, where I state a thesis, I give arguments, counter-arguments, and draw a conclusion. And so knowing that each one of those is different is a big part of the language demands. And if my students don't know that, I'm probably not going to get the results that I'm expecting. The last thing is assessment planning. And so this is really just all about, so as you teach, how do you know that you're being effective? You have this overall goal of, say, creating an argument, right? But I've broken it down, say, into 5 different skills, and I'm going to teach those in a certain order. And the question is, well, how do I know if they've mastered skill 1 before I move on to skill 2? And how do I know if they've mastered that and maybe can tie those 2 things together before I teach skill 3? And so the assessment planning part is all about making sure that you have identified the important touch points that you kind of need to keep track of in order to make sure that things are progressing and not going off the rails. Now, when we talk about the 5 rubrics, the first one is all about knowledge building. The second one is really all about identifying relevant knowledge of your students. And this again goes with their academic knowledge and their personal knowledge about the things that they care about and do in their personal life. The third one is, how would you use that information to make your lessons more effective? The fourth one is all about identifying those vocabulary, syntax, and discourse demands, all those things they need to be able to do, aren't really part of the lesson, but they need to be able to do, and making sure that you have structures that will support them if the students are struggling. Also making sure that you have some extension activities for kids who are mastering this really fast. And then the assessment planning is just like I said a few seconds ago. Now, for each one of these rubrics, I'm going to talk about what the major construct is that it's trying to measure, the major kind of skill, and then some do's and don'ts. Well, in some cases, there's just do's. Now, the first one, again, is all about building knowledge. And it's focused on how do the candidates' plans, and these are your lesson plans, build students' understanding of an essential literacy strategy for comprehending or composing text, and the skills that support that strategy. Now, when you're thinking about this and applying this to your lesson plans and how you talk about what you're trying to do with your lesson plans, number 1, make sure your lessons form a meaningful learning progression. Okay, meaning that lesson 2 is built off of lesson 1, and lesson 3 is built off of lessons 2 and 1, and lesson 4 is built off of the other ones. If you just have a series of unrelated lessons, that will not go well, right? The idea is that you are trying to build a complex skill, because anybody can list out facts and do flashcards. That's not what they're saying teaching is. They're saying it's about, there's an art to like coaching, right? You know how to build the skills, you know how to diagnose problems, you know how to fix them, just like that. Second point is, make sure you're explicit and point out exactly how the component skills build the essential literacy strategy. Just having them listed, right, in order 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 isn't going to be enough. You have to tell them, 1, how it relates to the essential skill, how that helps you with the central focus, and maybe even how it relates to the standard, right? And then with the next skill, you do the same thing. This is how it ties in with that other skill to get me this strategy. This is this, again, supporting this part of the central focus and this academic standard. Skill 3 does the same thing. Skill 4 does the same thing. Skill 5 does the same thing. Keep it straightforward, keep it clear, and it'll be really easy for somebody to follow exactly what you're trying to do. Third point is place the lessons in a meaningful context. In other words, put it in the context of a real world situation that the kids will actually be using in their real life. So if it's about an argument, right, have it about better lunchroom food, or getting a bigger allowance, or an allowance at all, or staying out later, or getting a cell phone, right? Put it in some kind of activity that the students can connect to and it will make sense, and they'll be more likely to use it in their real life. Finally, for literacy only, this is build a connection between reading and writing. You know, the idea of being a good writer means that I can take multiple reader perspectives. So I'm always thinking about how a reader is going to approach what I'm writing when I'm actually doing the writing. And this is similar to how we teach kids how to read text. We always try to say, well, take the author's perspective, or try to make connections to what the author's trying to do, right? In that, what I'm saying there is that in order to understand the writing better, I should think about what that writer was trying to do, even though I'm the reader at the time. Things you shouldn't do: don't have mistakes in your materials, typos, errors, don't define things in an incorrect way. That'll be an automatic 1 for this rubric. Second thing, make sure that everything's in alignment. Don't have activities that have nothing to do with your central focus or your strategy, right? Don't have problems, don't have questions that seem like they're of high interest to the kids, but have nothing to do with what you're trying to teach. Make sure everything's in order. And this, people do this a lot more than you would think they would. So be careful about that. Ask the cooperating teacher, ask your friends, ask Marie Benson. She'll be working with you as you go through this, or ask me. Assume the scorer will see how things relate is not something you should do. Again, I said this before, but be explicit about exactly how everything fits together. Now, rubrics 2 and 3 go together, and this is all about identifying important knowledge about your students, again, as it relates to the central focus, what you're basically trying to teach, and how do you use that. Now, the do's, again, make sure that everything you talk about has something to do with the central focus. Also, figure out where your students, that is, are likely to go wrong. In other words, where are the complicated or tricky parts? This is really hard to know the first time you teach something. It's really hard to know the second time you teach something. But as you teach something more and more, you're like, oh, this is where people always get tripped up. I should have a specific example and a specific exercise to target it because I know it's a sticking point. If you want to, right, the first time you teach something, ask somebody who's taught it before or look online. What are the normal problems or normal mistakes people make? And you'll have a leg up here. Another thing to do is to consider where your students are developmentally in terms of their cognitive, social, emotional, developmental, physical, developmental skills, right? In other words, if I'm teaching young kids like first graders who are kind of at the tail end of the pre-operational stage in Piaget's cognitive stages, they're going to have a hard time with ordering things, sequences, conservation tasks, and perspective taking, just to name a few things. And so I should be aware of that, and I should mention that and have plans to deal with that, because I know, developmentally speaking, this is where those students are at. I can extend that to concrete and formal operational thinking, right? Whether somebody's a novice or an expert or whatever. Or I can think about some other theories of interest development, of student motivation, of how math knowledge is built, and so on. The fourth thing is to justify each plan that you have. So if you say, I'm going to do this to make sure that students get this point, justify it with research or theory. And the general rule is for any kind of recommendation that you make like that, you should have some theory that goes along with it, whether it's, again, something as simple as Piaget's stages of cognitive development, Vygotsky's constructivism or the zone of proximal development, or some kind of multiple intelligence thing, right? All those theories, and there's a theoretical database that we have on the course website that you can use, download it. People have built it over the past few semesters. I'll want you to make a contribution to it as well if you can, but it's a really good resource for that. Last do in this case is plan for contingencies, right? You have all this information about your students. That should lead you to build in the right scaffolds, whether it's for supporting students who are going to be struggling and you know they're going to have some difficulty because it might be a little bit harder than they're ready for, or extensions for those kids who kind of already know what you're doing and you need to make it something that's still going to build their skill in a much general, broad sense even further. The only don't that I really have for this one is don't talk about students in a deficit framework, meaning don't talk about all the problems that they have, like their reading level so low and that they have these behavioral issues and they come from broken homes and they're poor and That doesn't matter. You're supposed to be looking for what they bring to the table. What are the things that they're energized about, interested in? What skills do they have that you can use? Talk about it in that way. And that's a very adaptive way of thinking about students. Now, rubric 4 is all about supporting language demands. And this is, again, all about identifying that vocab, syntax, and discourse that aren't really part of the lesson, but they're all things that they need to do in order to succeed at the lesson. Be clear on what each one of those things. They ask you for all of them, so if they're there, talk about them, and then design supports that are going to target those things to make sure that they're not going to be a problem, right? Because a lot of times we have a task and we teach students something and they don't get it, they don't succeed, and it's not because necessarily they can't do the skill, but they don't understand the task, or I'm making some assumptions about other things that they know and are able to do that I've never taught them and I just assume they knew, but they don't. And so make sure that you are proactive in thinking about and designing supports that are going to target those things. Don't focus on things that aren't related to the central focus. Again, that means you're out of alignment and you're wasting everybody's time, and it makes it look like you don't know what you're doing. And then also, don't set your sights so high that no mastery is present. And by this I mean, don't demand so much from your students that everyone will be struggling and you can't possibly support everything. And this kind of goes back to this last one about knowing where your students are, right? If I identify so many language demands and I realize that maybe I need to really rethink my goals to begin with because my students aren't really where I thought they are, maybe I should do that. So make sure in this idea that the language demands are doable, that you're not asking your kids to do things like, say you teach in 5th grade and all your kids are at a 1st grade reading level and you want them to do all this stuff. Well, if the kids can't read, you can scaffold all you want, but you're not going to get them to do what you need them to do if you're depending on them reading like 5th graders, because they won't be able to do that in 40 minutes, 45 minutes. The last one is assessment planning. And this is all about how are you going to use formal, informal, formative, summative assessments to figure out, again, where kids are at and whether or not they're meeting the goals that you're setting for them. Now, when we look at lesson plan examples, the best way to do this is using kind of a cyclical iterative system that kind of cycles through, where you say I have 2 objectives for my lesson 1. And so I introduce lesson 1. I do some broad assessments, casual assessments of the whole group to see if people are getting it by asking kids of different ability. I give some guided practice, monitoring more closely, and then I do independent practice. And again, I'm assessing there by walking around individually, monitoring students who I think are going to succeed, who I think are going to struggle, and so on. Then once a certain level of mastery is met, I will go into objective 2, repeating that process. Whole class instruction with the introduction of the idea, with a whole class assessment, guided or very highly structured or scaffolded activities, right, with, again, some general formative assessments. And if that's going well, then individual practice, again, me going around. And then maybe at the end, one final task that integrates those 2. But it's that idea of continually talking about, this is how I'm paying attention and knowing what's going on. That's just good practice. Second point is use pre-tests and post-tests. It makes it really, really easy to talk about how people have done and what they've learned if you can have a direct comparison between what they did at the beginning before you taught anything and what they're able to do at the end after you're done teaching. I've said this already. Use formal and informal assessments, and in the EdTPA they use those the same as formative and summative, even though they're not really just the same. A little more nuance than that, but we'll just leave it as it is. Make sure that you also modify or adapt assessments so that everyone can participate. If somebody has some kind of physical disability, some kind of reading disability, some kind of behavioral disability, or whatever, make sure that you modify things so everyone's able to demonstrate what they're able to do. And then last but not least, make sure that everything's in alignment. That if you say that these are my objectives, make sure you have assessment items covering those objectives. and you should be fine. So if you have questions about this, and there's an assignment that will be due, and if you miss class and listen to this, you probably will have questions, schedule an appointment with me during office hours or some other time during the week, and we'll figure it out together. But this should give you a good start and a good idea of what the planning section is all about.